back then, one of the DEA stated goals was to thwart legalization. So,
So the legalization, it helped the illegal.
I don't like the way it was done. If I was to write the policy, I would change legalization the way it is now to something more like a small business minded thing. Sort of like, instead of, my biggest concerns, to be quite frank, is we're going to end up with a big marijuana like we had big tobacco. We're going to have like 4 or 5 corporations that run the whole nations. And, I know for a fact Dennis Peronin and the other guys that were involved with this movement, like myself, what we wanted to see was more like microbrew equivalents, where you could have small businesses, lots of them, that are prosperous in lots of different areas, so that there's more wealth spread around, and the quality of it's just a better product.
That's what we have now.
Yeah, so the way it's going to end up, though, the way that when you look at the amount of growing, and there's like one company, I forgot the name, that's already past the 50% mark on controlling growth. And if they can get control of that, that's basically a de facto cartel, except, it's now sanctioned. And since the tax dollars come in, the politicians won't complain about it. But no, if I could reform it, I would actually prevent big business from taking it over. But that's a different topic altogether. So
Jeff, let's start at the beginning of your story.
Yes.
You got involved in this whole world at what age?
So basically, I first got involved with marijuana sales and everything literally right after I started smoking at the age of 16. I was one of those guys where the first few times that I tried pot, it actually didn't work. I puffed it, and I went from thinking that, there's these drug agents on TV and these cops busting these people, and there must be a good reason for it, to thinking this was one of the most ridiculous wars that you could think of. Because, again, the first time I tried it, my friends are loaded, and I'm like, I really don't feel a whole lot. So I'm like, I had actually at a point where I was like, maybe this plant's actually useless. And I tried it a second and a third, and probably the 4th or 5th time that I tried it, somebody had some extremely powerful stuff, and he made this thing called a gravity bong, which he used a container, you filled it with smoke using a protopipe, which was an old school pipe that real professional pot smokers used to have. Probably a few still have them now. And once I got loaded my first time, I took one of those hits. I was hacking my lungs out for like 5 minutes or something, and when I stopped coughing, the world was spinning, and then I finally realized, oh, okay, this is why they do it. And after that, it sort of, I guess it broke the ice for my brain to accept THC into my neural pathways, whatever the situation was with that. After that, I realized, wow, I actually like this stuff, and I smoked more. And before I knew it, I realized, wow, a lot of my friends also like to smoke this stuff. And so I happened to also grow up in a neighborhood where drugs were extremely prevalent. And we're talking going back way before I was ever around. The part of Fresno that I'm from, which for those of you outside of California, that is literally right in the middle of the state. The part of Fresno that I was from was notorious for years as a mafia controlled area when it came to the drug business. And when I say mafia, I'm talking out-of-state mobsters. We're talking Luciano, Charles Lucky Luciano himself sent his guys out, and my neighborhood was literally ground zero for that, for marijuana, other drugs too, heroin, unfortunately. And so by the time my era was around, the neighborhood was basically, it was just sort of an accepted thing, whether people liked it or not. And so I was pretty well connected pretty quickly. I was able to buy my first quarter pound of bud, and I sold about 1/3 of it, and then I smoked the rest of it. And after that one trial and error, I realized, wait a minute, you don't make drug profits by smoking all of your stuff. But I did make a good portion of my money back, so I knew the economics of it. But then I realized, wait a minute, You know, if you're selling pot, you can't be laying on your couch smoking pot. You know, you could smoke pot with other people and all that, but if all you're going to do all day is smoke weed, you won't make a whole lot of money. But I did figure out my friends and others liked it. And so the way things, you know, to sort of back up just slightly, my first real experience with marijuana was through my father. My father actually grew at our house when I was a kid. And so I did see what plants look like. He told me they were tomato plants, but I sort of knew better because my dad and my uncle don't smoke tomatoes. But I did notice that there was, whatever it was they were growing, it was something they liked to laugh about later. But so I had a pretty good idea of what it was growing up and all that good stuff. But I had this view that you know, the government has a reason for the laws, and maybe there's a good reason, who knows. And growing up as a kid, you see the DARE stuff on TV, all the commercials, and they tell you you're going to be using heroin the next day after you try weed. And I sort of bought into some of that propaganda. Again, through my own usage, I discovered that that wasn't quite the case. So with my sales stuff, it went pretty well pretty quickly. And there was a group of friends of mine in my neighborhood that we all kind of worked together. We were all involved in the business. And I got arrested, and I was arrested for trading weed for stolen goods. And that was a stupid thing to do. But at the time, I was, you know, selling it. People would bring stuff. Hey, I got this. You know, I got something that, you know, is valuable, and I'll trade it for a small amount of pot. And so I, you know, was trading marijuana for stolen stuff and got in trouble. And ultimately, I was escorted into juvenile hall for my first time in 1992. And one of the worst things that could happen happened. I was put into one of the worst units in the state of California. Escorted in at 4 a.m. with two others that were arrested with me. And we were put into one of the worst units, like I said, in the whole state. The worst 50 juveniles in my county were literally in this one place. And this particular unit was designed actually as a punishment unit. It was supposed to be single cell for kids who were fighting in other units, but because of how overcrowded the juvenile system was back then, they were housing regular, you know, housing kids in those units on a regular basis. 3 of us into a cell. And unfortunately for me, across from me was a group of gang members who did an infamous crime. And in California, if you sock a guy who's committed an infamous crime when you're behind bars, that is an instant skyrocket up in street credibility. And when I got into the cell that they booked me into, my 2 cellmates were both asleep still. And when they woke up, I got along with them. They were pretty cool guys, actually. One was a younger Mexican kid who was into car theft, and the other was a white kid who was selling cocaine at his school. And they were both on their way to youth authority. And I got along with them because that was the kind of kid I was. And they told me right away, we're going to be fighting with the guys right across from us. As soon as our cell doors open and the counselors walk away, we're going at it with them. And I'm like, oh, okay. You know, you're in a place like that, I can guarantee you when they tell you we're fighting these guys, whatever drama was there before you get there, kids, guess what? It becomes your drama. And fortunately, this whole melee was broken up quickly, but gangbangers from other gangs, Norteños and Bulldogs and Asian gangs, they were in another part of that unit, and they got to see me crack this one guy one time. Now, I got hit myself and all that. It was only 10, 15 seconds. It wasn't one of these juvenile hall fights where you see on TV or in a movie where every kid gathers around and they're all, yeah, and it's just going on for minutes. It was pretty quick. But these other guys, they saw, wow, this new kid in here was willing to at least take a punch and throw one. And that's all that matters. And I got out pretty quickly. A month or so later, some guy I didn't even recognize was like, hey, man, I remember you. And I'm like, what do you mean you remember me? He's all, you had a young white boy that was in the cell with, so-and-so and so-and-so, and you were in that squad with those 3 guys that shot the Christmas shopper in 1991, weren't you? Yeah, that was me. And he shook my hand. It was, he was a well-connected gang member, and he was one of the guys that helped get me the better prices on weed after that. And then it evolved. I met another 1 or 2. Before you know it, we're dealing with older homies, as they're called. And before you know it, there's I meet a local cartel-connected guy from, connected with the old Tijuana guys. Now, one thing that the audience needs to keep in mind here is do not use 2024's cartel frame of reference for 1992, because America's demographics are much different now. Back in today's world, there's Mexican-American communities all over the United States. And so much like when Italians settled different communities years ago and could move alcohol to each other, or Irish did the same thing, nowadays they can move, illegal substances to their communities in different cities and use those as a base for local sales. Well, back in the 1990s, it wasn't like that. Most Hispanics, especially Mexicans from Mexico, were concentrated in California, Arizona, Texas, the border states, basically. And so they needed African Americans like Crips and Bloods. They needed whites like biker gangs of all different types, the mafia, Italians. They needed Russians as well. Albanians, you name it, all the different, Eastern European, Southern European sort of mob groups. They needed Mexican Americans like the MA, the Mexican Mafia, which for people out of the state of California, Mexican Mafia is really the Mexican American Mafia. These are Mexican Americans who are first, second, third, whatever generation, and they're, they operate in the LA area as well as a lot of other areas. In Northern California, we had the Nuestra Familia, which was a breakaway group of the Mexican Mafia. And in my region, it was pretty much the no man's land in California where the Mexican gangs start to go from northerners to southerners. And so it was sort of the one area where people are close enough to drive to each other and do bad things to one another. So it was a war zone, quite frankly. And we also had Asian gangs in my region. We had TRGs, Lao Boys, ABs, which were Asian boys. We also had, of course, there was a few other different types of groups. They, too, were involved with cartel-type guys. I saw it firsthand. Anyhow, the cartel guys back then, it wasn't this stereotypical vicious, monster you see on these Sicario movies now. In fact, really a cartel is nothing more than a coalition of businessmen, really. It's not even like a mafia. The mafia has a top-down structure. You have soldiers and connected guys, associates at the bottom, kicking up money to captains, and they kick money up to bosses and management. Cartels are more like the marijuana guy that back then that could move 100 pounds knows the guy that moves 20, who knows the guy who moves 500. And, they sort of band together to work together. And in today's world, it's a little bit different. They're more sophisticated, more organized. But back in those days, it was more or less just a coalition of business-oriented guys. Now, were there some vicious types? Certainly. And just like with any other organized crime group, you're going to have a segment of the population that are sadistic and they're the guys that get called upon to do some of the heavy lifting, so to speak, when there's issues with informants or lack of payment or things like that. Anyhow, so I get connected, and the gentleman that I was connected to, his first name's Marcelo. And I called him from Fresno County Jail in February of 1994 when I was arrested. That lets you know how close he was to me in my life. And I called literally my parents' house. I called a gal that I had been seeing, and I called a cartel guy to let him know that I normally would not do that, but I was supposed to meet with him the next day, and you don't miss meetings with important people like that. And if you're going to be in jail and you do a complete no-show, that's not good. So I did a collect call to a phone line he had that he used that was really connected to his neighbor's house. And basically said hello, and he said very nicely to me, "What the F are you calling me for?" and hung up. That was our signal that everything's cool. What the F are you calling me for? Hangs up. That let him know, okay, my boy's in jail for a little bit. Whenever he gets out, he'll come visit. So, you don't want to talk explicit on jail phones. They are monitored, and they do record those calls routinely. When they say that on those signs, they definitely mean it. It's already bad enough having to call the person in the first place because it links you together. Anyhow, that brought my prices down, and I did extremely well locally selling weed. We were also involved in some other things, the early days of the crank business, although I got out of that pretty quick because I had one or two negative experiences with it, and I didn't like dealing with tweakers, to be quite frank. They call you at all hours. They definitely don't have a whole lot of manners when they're fiending. It's a big difference between a lot of the other drugs and marijuana. Most pot smokers, you tell them, call me between this time and this time, they're pretty good about it. You'll have a few that don't, but for the most part, most pot smokers are mellow, and the profits were good enough back then. So when you look at my group, where it really exploded and where I really got in over my head now that I look back at it, one of my friends moved back east to Michigan. He was originally from Michigan. He lived here in California for a number of years. He moved back there. And within a month or two of moving back there, which this would have been in 1993 when I was on probation for juvenile crimes and stuff, and I was still selling pot, of course. He called me up and he said, "Hey, look, the prices back in Michigan are just outrageously higher than California with the rates we can get through Cello and others. We could be making a fortune. I'm connected with, he had mentioned that I'm connected with some syndicate guys, which when someone says syndicate in California, that means mafia. He said, I'm connected with some syndicate guys, et cetera, et cetera. I brought it to Marcelo, and he actually said, I don't want anything to do with that, because he was worried that the mafia at that time was under mass surveillance by the FBI. And he was right to be worried about that, because 1992, 93, the whole 90s, the FBI had task forces all over the United States going after every mob family that you can think of. And so he was very smart and astute to say no to that. However, like everybody else in the drug business, there's always somebody that's willing to not follow the rules. And one of his friends who was also connected in Mexico kind of pulled me to the side. So how much weight do those guys want? And it evolved. I started producing the weight that these guys wanted. The first meetup that I had with anybody from the mob was accidental, though, because originally, before I could get everything going, my friend that moved back there sent one of the guys out west, and he had something else set up and it fell through. And so he calls me frantically, and I said, well, I've talked to one of Cello's other guys, so yeah, I can do something. And he saw, well, the guy's in California now. Like, what? You mean he's here? I don't have time to set this up. And, getting 10 pounds, 20 pounds, 50 pounds is not the same as getting a $20 bag of weed. Trust me. There's a lot more logistics. It takes a lot more work, and you have to develop rapport and trust and all kinds of things that you don't have to do over a $20, bag that could be smoked up in a day. And so I said, all right, well, I'll at least meet the guy. I go out, I meet the gentleman. I got along with him. We pulled our shirts up and pulled our pants down to show that we didn't have wiretaps. Nothing beyond checking for wiretaps. And so we were both like, all right, we can talk a little bit more open. We walked around, and basically he told me that, look, we've got big plans. He's like, we want to do some big stuff. And he told me that they had been picking up weed in Texas prior to this. They had guys there, but they liked the idea of picking up in California. And California itself was picking up because of the NAFTA trade agreement. We started having diesels that could cross the border with less search issues and things like that. So it helped facilitate moving the larger amounts into the USA from Mexico as far as the Mexican-grown weed. And so we started doing all that kind of stuff and connecting it. I'd connect 10 pounds, 20, whatever. And then before you know it, I'm starting to help them move it as well. Now, the ways that we moved it, we would use Amtrak. We would use the Greyhound system. Sometimes we would drive, rent U-Hauls, things like that. Now, when we would take it on, when it came to like Greyhound or Amtrak, those would be typically 20 or 30 pounds, because if you're in a big duffel bag, you can fit approximately 20 to 30 in there of the old Mexican brick bud, and that's wrapped up or vacuum sealed, and we did some other things to mask the smell and things like that. You could fit about that much in there. So one or two people, if you're both carrying it, you can probably get about 50 pounds between the two of you, maybe a little bit more. And for those, we would go on like the Greyhound. It's a 2.5 day, 3 day trip from California to Michigan. And believe me, it's not a fun trip, but you get to, there's a lot of money involved. We would get paid quite a bit extra. We'd get like $100 a pound or more just for moving it. And with Amtrak, we would get sleeper cars, and we'd have like 3 or 4 of us that would be in one area, and we'd all have our bags or whatever. And what we would do is we would disguise what we were doing, because you have to have a good cover story anytime you're moving anything illicit like that, because state troopers and local cops are allowed to board those buses and those trains. If you're driving a shipment, they can pull you over in any state. And they always will ask you and your friends, what are you doing? What's your purpose for traveling to this area? They ask you questions like that just to see if you guys tell different stories, which a lot of times that's how they catch people, quite frankly, is the couriers don't have their stories together. And so it becomes fishy. That gives them probable cause. They search you more. So we would do things like we would say, hey, we're if they ask, why are you going to Michigan? Well, we're applying for jobs there. We're 19, 20-year-olds. We're moving out of our houses. Our parents don't want us living there. They told us to leave at 18. And we'd even have fake made resumes up, that we'd carry with us. They'd ask, oh yeah, you're applying for jobs there? Yeah. Here, check this out. Here's a resume for this, and we even, our friends in Michigan would give us the names and addresses of businesses that younger people would be likely to apply for. And we'd have a fake, with our assumed names that we used to travel under. Yeah, here's my cover letter, actually. Hey, look, okay. And that kind of stuff just gets the cops onto the next person especially when they do bus searches and train searches, especially in the 90s, they would actually search everybody in most cases. They didn't usually just single people out, although if they believe you're the one, they'll do it. But oftentimes their way of saying that the search is constitutional is by saying, well, we searched everybody on the thing. It's sort of like before you enter a stadium, it's the searches of everybody is constitutional because you're doing it to everybody rather than selective. Anybody who knows court case law will understand what I'm talking about. And so they'd search everybody. They'd look at your bags. They'd look at your tickets. They'd see, they'd ask you questions. And as long as your story's, like, yeah, you're just applying for a job or whatever else, something that makes sense and doesn't sound ridiculously, that would never happen, they move on to the next person. And, I had a number of times where I got extremely nervous from police searches, usually in states where the penalties for marijuana trafficking were the highest. I've been searched in Nevada, which in today's Nevada, you can buy marijuana on the strip. Back in the 90s, they would put you away for seeds. I'm serious. You could go away for under an ounce. You could actually get a prison sentence in Nevada for carrying, in California, we always could have at least an ounce back in the day, and it was just personal use, and you get maybe a ticket at best. Nevada, you could go to prison. Well, I wasn't carrying just an ounce. I was carrying 20 pounds, 30 pounds, and if they link all of us together and then they look at my records and they're like, oh, you seem to be the ringleader. So not only is the 25 you're carrying, but you're taking responsibility for the other bags too. And all of a sudden, I'm not getting out of prison until I'm 38 years old or something, as a 20-year-old. So, I did, it hardened me up though. It got me to where I could endure police searches pretty well. I learned through trial and error, and we were largely successful. We had one extremely close call though. Myself and a mob associate from Michigan, we were taking a load back there. We were both carrying, and we're taking the Greyhound, and this one we're taking it from California all the way into Detroit, and we weren't going to do any bag switches. That was another little trick we would do, is we would sometimes have a guy meet us in Chicago. We go into the bathroom, have the exact same duffel bag, the exact same size, but with clothes in it instead. We'd swap underneath. Continue the trip. So if the DEA or the FBI is monitoring where you're going on the train or the bus, now you're carrying something with nothing in it but clothes. They can search all they want. But we didn't do any bag switch or anything. We literally had this stuff on us, and it just seemed so off and off. We had one of those feelings like there's something really bad that's going to happen to us. And the bus breaks down about 2 hours away from Detroit itself, outside of like Kalamazoo, Michigan, which is, for those of you familiar with Michigan, Interstate 94 takes you across Michigan into Detroit from, and Kalamazoo's like in the middle roughly, or it's towards the front. Ann Arbor is closer to Detroit, but it broke down and it caused the bus to delay. And they had to do whatever repairs, and they finally get it going, and we go into Detroit. My mob associate friend and I are both carrying, I had about 20 pounds or so in my bag. He had about the same, maybe a little bit more. And we walked by some guys that appear to be looking past us. I'll never forget, I see this guy, and he looked like a stereotypical like Puerto Rican or Italian undercover agent with the mustache, and he looked like one of those dudes that you'd see on those documentaries who said, yeah, I infiltrated the mafia in New York, and then they sent me to Miami, and I pretended to be a Cuban drug trafficker. One of those guys that just can pass for anything, right? And a great, looking past me, right? And my mob associate friend signals to me like there's something, something's really bad. We get outside of the Greyhound station in Detroit, and he takes off running to the first cab that he sees. So I just naturally run too. We hop in. He pulls out a $100 bill. This is back when minimum wage in California was $4.25, which means in Michigan it was probably $2 an hour or something low, way lower than California. And he pulls out like 100, and he tells him, step on the gas, and the guy's like, yes, sir. You could tell this is going to be a good payday. And he's telling him, drive 2-3 lights this way, make a right. And he basically said something like, bro, my girlfriend's going to dump me if we don't get to this event on time. He said that to the cab drivers as an excuse for, we got to go fast. I'm going to lose my woman, bro, please. He didn't say, oh yeah, we're running from the cops, or, nothing stupid like that. So, turn this way, one of those things. And we finally hit this one area, And he's like, all right, stop here. And he gives him the 100. The tab for the cab ride was maybe $20. He's like, keep it. We get out and, we hop like a fence or two, and he opens up this, like the outside to underneath a house, and throw it in there. And then when I'm like, what the hell just happened? He's like, we were set up. And I'm like, what do you mean we were set up? He's all, I recognized at least 2 narcs in there from previous cases. He's all, bro, we get prosecuted all the time. The same guys, the task force only has so many different agents. And, if you plead not guilty, they have to appear in court and testify. So you get to figure out what they look like if you've seen them before. And anyhow, he wasn't bullshitting, because the next day when I went to leave Michigan, I was on a bus and 2 guys walk up to me. Normally, I would not have left the very next day. Normally, that's extremely suspicious, but considering the circumstances, we were like, you need to get the hell out of here and you need to get back to California now. And we couldn't just fly back. That looked really bad. You're on a bus, you deliver a load of drugs, and then you hop on a plane home the next day. That's just a dead giveaway. The DEA is not stupid. And so I'm on the bus, and 2 agents walked up to me and they said, you got an ID? I'm like, no, I don't have one. They're all, let's see your ticket then. And they looked at my ticket. I had bought it to Los Angeles rather than to Fresno. A lot of times we would do that. We would buy our tickets to cities outside of where we lived, and we would sometimes have people meet us with cars, or we would buy a new ticket at the new place, and then, like that, just in case, because we weren't sure how we were all, the government monitors God knows what. You just have to sort of guess when you're in the criminal underworld what you got to do to stay off their lists. Back then. In today's world, I don't think you're going to stay off any government lists with today's electronics and AI and all that. But back then, we did what we could. And so I bought my ticket to LA. They said, oh, so you're from LA? And they said the assumed name that, I had used. I said, okay. And they just left. And that was the loneliest time that I had ever felt in my life up until then. The bus had maybe 40, 50 other people in there, a lot of them college kids. This was in March of 1994. So there was college kids from the Midwest that were taking the Greyhound down to like Florida and to, for their spring break stuff. Here I am, I'm 18 years old, and I just had 2 agents come up and try to ID me in front of all these people. And for the first hour or so, I'd look around and it seemed like nobody acknowledged that I even existed. I looked around, nobody was looking back at me. And I would hear them talk, and I'd hear these kids talking about how, they're gonna go do this for spring break. And, they're talking about, man, I need to get good grades in this class. And I'm thinking, these kids have these minuscule problems. I'm thinking I'm going to get arrested by the FBI or the DEA any freaking minute. Any one of these cities on my way back, they could haul me in and say, we got what we want, we got a case. So, I was like, these kids have no idea what a problem is. And, they wouldn't look at me. Nobody looked at me for like 2 hours. And then finally, somebody said, hey, what was that about? And I'm like, I don't know. I have no idea. I had to pull that one. You got to not know a lot of stuff when you're in the criminal underworld. You have to, I don't know that guy's name. I've never heard of this. So what do you mean that? I've never heard of that group. But anyhow, after that, I did make it back home, and I knew I was identified, though. There's no way they're not going to know who you are. And, from then on, I had to be a little bit more careful. And I stayed away from actually moving the stuff. And then I would have front people And then we also changed a lot of other things. One of the things that we started doing was we stopped talking on regular phones. And when I mean talking, we didn't say explicit things on phones, but we did talk to each other on phones to get to know each other and chat about regular common life stuff. But we stopped talking altogether. And something that I started doing was I started tapping into regular people's phones to make my drug calls. I had a few friends that had some electronic knowledge, knew how to hack. And so back in the 80s and 90s, we used to have cordless phones. For those of you in this particular age group, you'll know what I'm talking about. The base the station for the phone, had an antenna, and it plugged into your phone line and then into the normal phone system. The handset had an antenna, and you could obviously walk around your property. Anyhow, my electronic friends showed me how to take CB antennas that are magnetic mount on cars and trucks, plug normally into a CB radio, but fasten them into the handset of a cordless phone and catch the right frequencies to where I could drive in front of people's houses, and occasionally I could make a signal from my antenna and my phone handset that's attached to it to the inside of their home where their base station was, so that when I'm making a call, there's an electronic signal from antenna to antenna, and then it's going through their phone number, meaning it's the FBI, the DEA. There's no way for them to tap that. The only way they could have tapped that is if I was dumb enough or unlucky enough to tap into some guy's phone who's under surveillance for a different reason. Then they would hear me. So I started doing things like that. We started also disguising our conversations by referring to things in TV shows. For instance, we would see like a documentary about one of the wars, Vietnam, let's just say. And if they, I'd say, hey, did you see the episode about, the Tet Offensive, whatever? And remember how many bombs they said they dropped? And let's say it was 50 bombs or whatever. Oh, yeah. I remember the number they mentioned there. That's quite a bit. I'd send the signal that I could get like 50. We would make references to TV show stuff like that just to get an idea. Okay, and we'd get like women that, to talk to each other on the phone, and we'd be in the background. They would talk about sewing or something, and whatever. We would find some other thing to talk about, and so we just. We did all kinds of stuff, just stuff that you shouldn't have to do to hide what you're doing for a living, which is why you shouldn't be involved with this stuff in the first place, kids. You got to do so many things to hide your activities. We would send money back by we would take like let's just say a car seat, and we'd have a woman in Michigan. We hollow out part of the car seat, put a bunch of money in there, $100 bills for the amount, reseal the package, and she mails that car seat to another woman here in California who has a baby, so that, the male people, and then get the money there that way. We just did so many different things to hide what we were doing, that it was just, it drives you crazy in and of itself. The paranoia that comes from being involved in that whole world, it is a paranoia that I would not wish upon my worst enemy. And there's no amount of money that you can make that can, that can justify the mental damage you do to yourself and the emotional damage you do to yourself. And I found that out as I got out of all this stuff. Throughout the 90s, I obviously, as I had mentioned earlier, I had been arrested for other things. Well, one of the things I was arrested for in the 90s put me on probation in California. And one of the probation terms was to attend college. So I went to Fresno City originally, and then Fresno State. I was there during the Jerry Tarkanian era. And there's party scene, all that. I made a good amount of money selling weed locally, obviously on campus and things like that as well. And I left the whole mob in marijuana, and we also did some illegal casino gambling nights as well with the mob out here too, behind around 2002. However, I found myself, I was already getting into the trap of addiction prior to that. There's a certain level of stress that comes with the paranoia of hiding everything you do from the government and worrying about arrest and, all that kind of stuff. I would find myself drinking, and especially in a college atmosphere, partying like crazy. And I would sober up, though, before any time they would come out here. For a week or so before any mobster or anybody important in the drug world would come out, I would stop smoking pot and I would stop drinking because they hated that stuff. And if I had any detection of having a problem, this is what happens. It's like the Taliban when it comes to drug addiction in the mafia or with cartels. They find out you have an addiction problem. You don't get to say, hey, look, I need to go to a program. They say, oh, we'll solve your addiction problem real quick. He's not an addict anymore. He's dead. That's how it works. Drug addiction, alcohol addiction, whatever can lead to execution in that world. So you don't dare. You go out of your way to hide addiction better than you would from your parents or from anybody you could think of in life. When you know that there's a death penalty associated with usage, you will, believe me, you will do what you got to do. You will quit what you got to quit just in time to avoid it. So I would find myself stopping just beforehand. But once I was done with that whole world in 2002, I no longer had my personal Taliban, so to speak, to keep me from having daily and all that other issues. And that was around the same time that OxyContins started to really hit the market. And I got even luckier. I got into a minor car accident, and it was the other person's fault. So I got to go to the doctor, and I got to say, hey, those Vicodins that you gave me for the first week or two, they're really helping me. And, a little bit later, I got to say, hey, I think I need double or triple the number of Vicodins that you've been prescribing me. Because, it's helping me, but it's just not helping me like it used to. Before you know it, how about morphine? Before you know, well, let me, I've heard of this stuff called OxyContin, and, they say it works wonders, and of course, back then, Purdue Pharma, our friends over there in the pharmaceutical industry, were busy telling doctors that this was a new wonder cure for every ailment you could think of. Yeah, you give people enough opiates, believe me, they won't have any pain at all, and they won't feel any bad things until they come off of it. And then I found myself being able to get a small prescription of that, and then I found myself getting hooked on that. And I had always had this belief, and this is a mafia type belief, that drug addicts, again, I've told you guys just now how they deal with them. We viewed addicts as scumbags. Ironically enough, we're selling and moving drugs, right? But we viewed the people that use them as scumbags. Make that be logical in your head there. Imagine like the alcohol companies doing a commercial saying, every one of you people who drink are filth. They wouldn't do that. But that's how the mob, that's how cartel guys, they really do. They view people who consume their products as garbage. And so I'm like, I find myself, well, I'm not using heroin, I'm using OxyContins, and that's a pill, and it's legal, so it must be okay, because I did the loophole exemption from addiction admitting, if you will. I can't be an addict because this is legal. Yeah, the doctors, I got a note, I got a doctor's note, And then I tried quitting oxys my first time, and I had I'm laying in a corner, oh gosh, my body temperature's going up and then down. literally within minutes. I can't sleep for 2-3 days. And then I'm like, I need more of these. And I take a few of them. Oh, wow. I feel normal now again. And I started to realize, you know what? I'm freaking hooked. Now, you wouldn't have gotten me to admit that to any of my former street friends, which I knew quite a few of them. You couldn't get me to admit any of that. And during that time between 2002 and 2005, I was pretty much just, I was hemorrhaging cash. I had saved up a good amount of money from my marijuana businesses and my illegal gambling stuff in the 90s. And I was paying it right back to illegal OxyContin dealers. So for any of you IRS agents who might be watching this show, if you want to send me an old tax bill, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you that I get to write off all of the money that went right back into the drug system, So, but I still had a little bit of luck left in me, because in 2005, I finally got off of OCs right about October to November, and it was only because my friends ran out, quite frankly, and I couldn't get any. And so I was sort of forced to just go through the BS. And for those of you who've ever had to quit opiates, shout out to you, because, it's not good to get hooked on them in the first place, but if you do and you can actually quit, it is a hell of a thing to do, to be able to accomplish. And always remember that that's a big accomplishment. I had 3 to 4 weeks of hell on earth quitting oxys. And I had one piece of luck, and it was the single biggest piece of luck, I think, in my life. Actually, 2 pieces of luck around that time. I was unwinding the last of my local marijuana sales. I had no mob ties for 2-3 years by then, but I was still selling locally, and I was sort of passing my customers on to my friends who were still in the business slowly, sort of passing my clientele over. And I had a meetup at a house with 3 gentlemen on January 31st of 2005. And when I left, I put a bag with a good amount of money that had been owed to me from the past, and some other stuff was in there, into my trunk, and I got pulled over randomly. And what was in the trunk could have got me a decent amount of prison time. And while I was being pulled over, the officer said, "Hey, your license is expired. Did you know that?" I had been on OxyContin on my birthday that year and was lazy. I didn't go get my license renewed. I knew it was expired. When he told me it was expired, I'm like, great, and he's going to tow my car. Now, luckily, the vehicle I was in was my now ex-wife's mother's vehicle. We were boyfriend, girlfriend at the time. Actually, no, we had just gotten married, actually. Sorry. We had just gotten married. And so I honed in my old 1990s being searched as a professional marijuana mafia man skills and said, "Hey, officer, look, I understand you got to tow my vehicle, but this is my wife's mom's car, and my wife's underwear and panties and stuff are back there. I don't want some tow truck guy sniffing, that kind of. Do you mind if I just take a bag of my wife's clothes and other stuff with me, and then tow my vehicle?" Yeah, no problem. And I understand that. The officer said, yeah, I get that. So he opens up my trunk, and he's watching me as he's writing this ticket for no license and speeding or whatever else. And I'm like, I have a grocery bag, paper grocery bag, and I'm trying to put, her personal effects in there very slow. And I saw one moment where he split second turned his head. I grabbed this bag, shove it in there, and immediately grab a couple towels, put it over. And at the time, I told him my cell phone was dead. This is 2005, so this is when cell phones weren't even really smartphones at that point. They were more the flip phones. So, oh, my cell phone's dead. And I'm like, look, there's a payphone across the street. You've got my car. You've got my license. Would you mind if I call for a ride? He's like, yeah, no problem. He let me walk across the street. I had the bag with me, and I went and called one of my friends, and I left the bag next to the payphone and walked back over to my vehicle, and they towed it. Well, unbeknownst to me, the house I had left was under FBI and DEA surveillance. And when I was pulled over, this was a completely random one. This was not one of those situations where the DEA calls the local cops and says, hey, we want you to target this guy and get him. This was just a random speed thing. I was speeding and, but what this did for me was, since my vehicle was towed, the DEA, FBI got to look at my vehicle, and there's nothing in there incriminating because, I carried it out. And it kept me out of an operation called Operation Greenspeaker. Operation Greenspeaker targeted Mexican suppliers in my area. We're talking cartel-connected guys, some of my friends, old friends. Targeted my friends from Mendocino and Humboldt, the Emerald Triangle as it's called, which for those of you outside of California, it's considered our top pot-growing place here in our state. And in today's legal marijuana environment, if you can get a hold of Humboldt and Mendocino quality weed, you're probably pretty happy. And they went after a whole bunch of them. And the difference between me being labeled an unindicted co-conspirator versus being listed in a RICO indictment was that pullover, because that's exculpatory evidence. Operation Greenspeaker had started just prior to that. The DEA had busted a football player in Atlanta. He was a Georgia Tech football player. He was caught with 100+ pounds. You guys can look it up. It was on ESPN. You search the internet. You can read the whole story of how they linked it back to my area and who all was arrested ultimately. But the DEA in Atlanta caught him with 100+ pounds of weed because he was moving it back there. Our Mexican suppliers didn't just have guys like me back in the day. There was plenty of guys, like I said, they needed different groups. Guys in California that were cartel connected were, had friends, black friends in Atlanta, and another guy that might be who's connected in Indiana, another one in Nebraska, another one in Washington State. Didn't matter. And so the guy busted in Atlanta snitched and said, hey, the main guys are Mexican guys in California, and there's a group of white dudes that work with them, and they're all friends, and yada, yada, yada. And it led back to my bros. And out of the 3 guys that were in that house, one of them became a federal informant. Absolutely a federal informant. In fact, ironically enough, he's friends with me on Facebook, and he admitted to me, at some point, yeah, I was the guy that snitched. I was like, I don't care. I didn't go to prison, so hey, it wasn't my problem, and I'm a citizen now, so hey, I sure in the hell wouldn't do any dirt with the dude, that's for sure, and I don't do it now anyways. But the reality is that quitting OxyContins, and the reason why, by the way, that I left that meeting early was because my then wife called me up saying she missed her period. And I found out later on that my then wife was pregnant with our only child, who's now an adult. And so one of the reasons that kept me off of oxys after that was my daughter finding out that I was going to be a father. And Operation Greenspeaker hit right as my daughter was being born. My friends were being arrested in phases, 5, 10 at a time. And then the next phase, the DEA, they get enough evidence for the next group. The way they do things, the DEA, when they arrest you, they look through everything to see who you're ever linked to. Back in the day when we would do our drug running trips, we were not allowed to take pictures with one another. We were not allowed to take pictures while traveling on drug routes because that is incriminating evidence. They find your camera and you're taking pictures on a known drug route like Interstate 80, let's say, all the way out of California back east. you're incriminating yourself. And basically, the DEA was able to get one group. They'd find evidence. Oh, he knows this one, and this one knows this one. Boom, a next set. And ultimately, Operation Greenspeaker took out a lot. It literally destroyed, let's put it this way. If I had ever wanted to get back into the weed business after Operation Greenspeaker, it was over for me because I didn't have any connections left. That's how thorough when the DEA and the FBI and those guys start hopping out of cars and hopping, darn near swinging on a rope through your window to arrest you. They make it dramatic. That's for sure. When they get you and they get everybody, they can really shut the lights out on the whole thing, and that's what happened with me. I wasn't able to go back. And thank goodness I didn't, because I had my daughter, got further in my career. And I'll just touch real quick on my career briefly before I conclude this for this episode. So I got into politics. I have 2 bachelor's degrees from Fresno State and an associate's as well. So I have 3 college degrees technically. Thank you, California courts and strict judges, because it turns out you did me the single biggest favor by threatening me with state prison. Because I did not want to go to state prison. I didn't think state prison would be a really nice place for me. And so I decided to stop the street crime garbage, and I at least went to school. Now, I was still selling weed and all that, but at least I wasn't doing the stuff that gets citizens really pissed off at you. I did get into politics, and I was, in 1992, like I said, I was being led into juvenile hall, one of the worst units. By 2002, I'm at the state capitol of California toasting with politicians after winning elections. And I worked in political consulting, so I've had Democrat, Republican. I've had both sides hire me to help them with their campaigns. And my first campaign, though, was probably my proudest. The medical marijuana campaign in 1996. One of the few good things I can say I did with my illegal pot money was I filtered a decent portion of it into get out the vote efforts and things like that when I was 21 years old. Medical marijuana passed Prop 215 in November of 1996, just after I turned 21. By then, leading up to the measure getting on the ballot, I was already well established, mob stuff, all that. I was doing extremely well. And so I knew that this measure was going to be on the ballot. And I reached out to Dennis Perone, the late Dennis Perone, good man, San Francisco, old school hippie kind of guy. And I was like, hey, what can I do to help? And he's all, well, we don't have anybody in your area of California doing anything. You're in the Central Valley. We've got people in LA. We got people in the Bay Area, Berkeley, San Francisco, and all that, but we don't have anybody there. I said, all right. And I'm like, what do I do? He's all, get people to vote for it. Okay. So I basically I took illegally earned marijuana money from the prohibition world, and I paid pot smokers to get out and, hey, you want this stuff legal? All right, well, the first thing we need to do is get medical passed, because America's not ready for outright legalization, but we could at least tell them to help out the people with AIDS and cancer and stuff, and glaucoma and all that, right? And I paid pot smokers to knock on doors and do this. It was successful, though. I can say that I had no political experience of any kind, but I did have a lot of illegal money, and they handed me, they gave me the handouts, and they gave me a bunch of Prop 215 yard signs, and get them out there, have people knock on doors and tell them to get out and vote and all that, right? So if the DEA is upset, unfortunately, DEA, that's not an asset, so you can't go back and seize it. If you want some of my old campaign signs, I think I got a couple left in the garage somewhere. You guys are more than welcome to have a couple of my old campaign signs if you want to seize what's left of that. But So I can say that it was a huge mixed bag. And, by 2002, again, I'm out of the game, all that. I get into these addiction issues. I quit the oxys. However, there was still one problem left. When you quit opiates, sometimes it causes you to start taking sleeping meds and things like that because of the issues related to quitting opiates. That's another problem that happens. Well, I start with 1992. We go to 2002. Well, guess what happens in 2012? I get humbled beyond belief. I lose my career and everything because I decided to take I won't say the name of the well-known prescription sleeping aid that we used to see commercials for all the time. It's not really around as much anymore. It starts with an A, but I won't say what it is. And I took it the evening before driving my daughter to school. And you're supposed to wait 8 hours. I waited about 7.5. And guess what? 7.5 hours is not good enough for the highway patrol. And I got in trouble taking my daughter to school, and I had a corporate job. I was going to drop her off at school and, go to my corporate job and, trying to be the so-called good American taxpayer. And I lost custody of my daughter as a result because my ex-wife and I were in the early stages of a divorce too. And I lost my daughter. I was prosecuted, and quite frankly, and this is a lesson I want the younger people to understand, the single biggest reason to stay out of the game is that once you are identified by the government as being a criminal, you could be the best guy on earth for the next 20 or 30 years, but if you go back and commit any kind of crime, they are going to treat you like a kingpin again. They're going to treat you like a guy that never learned his lesson. If you're in a street gang or you're involved with street gang violence or whatever as a kid and you straighten up your life and then 20 years later you do something stupid, guess what? They're not going to care that you did all that good stuff or whatever. In fact, they're going to assume that you just were smart enough to get away with it, which to some degree, I hate to say it, but that was sort of right to some degree with me. And so they prosecuted me, and I deserved it. At first, I was upset and bitter, and like, wait a minute, if I was, a soccer mom, and this same thing happened, they wouldn't have done anything. Even my lawyer, that I hired was like, man, you must have done something to piss off the DA's office a long time ago, or do they not like you for some other reason? He's like, I've never seen a case where you get a DUI for freaking sleeping beds, especially, with a half-hour time interval, all that. I'm like, well, have you looked at my previous theft arrests and some of that from my juvenile days? And when I told him about that, he's like, okay, that would explain it. You were a pain in their ass a long time ago, and they figure that a guy like you already got away with so much that you deserve whatever they can give you at any given moment. But it was actually good for me. It taught me humility. It took me off of my mafia-esque kind of pedestal where I thought I was better than other criminals even. That's another thing with the mob and with cartel guys. They think they're like the upper class of the criminal world, and everybody else are freaking nobodies and scumbags compared to them and all that kind of stuff. It knocked me off my pedestal, and for the first time, I actually got the treatment that I had needed years ago for the oxys. I had quit OxyContin and all that, cold turkey, but I never actually went through recovery. I didn't understand why it was that I got addicted in the first place. And so the courts ordered me to do 90 days at a decent program. It wasn't the Betty Ford Center. It was meant for guys who, commit felony drug offenses and misdemeanor drug offenses in some situations. And but I did a 90-day inpatient, 6 months outpatient, and I finally learned that I'm just a normal man. And, I'm no matter what was told to me when I was younger by these older mob characters, filling my head, telling me how important I was, how great I am, wow, you're just able to pull this off and that off. You're able to beat the cops and the feds and all that, which is not supposed to be an accomplishment in life, by the way. But, you know, in my sick world at the time, that's how, you know, that's a feather in your cap if you can beat them at any given time. And the other thing it did too was it put me back in touch with probably the most important mafia member that I ever have known. His name's Joe Donato. I'm going to conclude it with this. Joe Donato left the mob about 3 months before I was born. I was born in 1975. He was a major figure in the mob in California. He beat 2 murder cases in LA County. He killed a guy in Burbank over gambling debts, killed another guy, not guilty verdicts. He beat numerous cases. And he was, at one point, maybe the 3rd or 4th most important mafioso in the whole state. And we're talking in the 1950s and 60s when the mob had a lot of control in California. DA's offices were still corrupt at that time. Police chiefs, including my old city, were being bribed by the mafia and being allowed to sell drugs and do all their other rackets because of their bribery. But he had quit the mob years, you know, just before I was born. By then, he was a born-again Christian, you know, and all that stuff, but very sincere. He was the kind of guy, he took his mafia earnings and he actually he sent a bunch of money to orphanages in India, in South Africa, and other places around the world. He went to apartheid South Africa, and he was one of the first guys to give a sermon in front of a black and a white mixed congregation. He kind of joked about how being of Italian descent and how Italy's like kind of in between North Africa, Northern Europe. He's like, who better than me to, you know, put black people and white people in the same room and have you guys shaking hands and not fighting each other. So he did a lot of positive things. He donated a ton of his illegally made money. Very genuine, sincere man. And he told me that no matter how much money he made, there's no amount of money that can make you sleep good at night when it's made illegally. You could have millions of dollars, and there's lots of drug dealers out there who probably say, hey, I made a fortune, I sleep great. I got the most expensive mattress. Yeah, you can afford the most expensive mattress, but you can't get the peace of mind in that industry. There's no way to do it, because by its nature, you're forced to live a separate existence from who you actually are. You don't even become who you were meant to be in life until you get out of it. And Joe Donato taught me that it didn't matter your street rank. None of that matters. All that kind of life. What matters is your relationships and what people will say about you when you're no longer on this earth. Are they going to say you're a good guy? Are they going to say you're a bad guy? Are you famous or are you infamous? Are you a regular person that just, you know, did the right thing, or are you somebody who did absolutely the wrong thing? Joe Donato passed away in 2017, 2018 roughly, and he didn't just help me. He helped gang members in my region. He used to go to juvenile halls and prisons all over our state and all over the country. He helped numerous young people to get away from all these negative lifestyles. And I cannot thank him enough, because one of the things he told me is that you need to be you. You know, when you were a kid, did you really think that you wanted to grow up and be some mafioso? I'm of Irish descent, by the way, so I was a connected or an associate. You can't be a made man unless you're of Italian descent. However, you can be an extremely powerful associate still if you're making money and all that. And I was like, no, of course not. I thought the mob and criminals were scumbags because I would see the prostitution near my house when I was a kid. And my dad explained to me that, you know, these guys show up, they get their services, if you will, and then these women are drug addicted, so many times they're victims themselves. And by then I knew, you know, of course, that I knew what addiction was by then. because I went through it. And he's like, well, and behind every prostitute, there's a pimp that takes most of her earnings. And behind every pimp, there's a mafioso who takes a lot of his earnings. And then he pays off the cops or whoever else. And the system just does what it does at that point, and it exists. Like, did you really want to be a mobster or whatever when you grew up? Of course not. I thought of them that, they were bad people. It's a bad influence on our neighborhood. I wanted to be a working person. I wanted to be able to say I run a business. And he said, you know what? You can still do that. And now, I said, you start off with 1992 is an important year for me as a juvenile because that's when I first started hitting the system. 2002, I graduated from college and started a career, but I get issues related to that. 2012, I get humbled. Well, by 2022, just 2 years ago, you know what I am now? By then, a regular guy with a good, legit, successful business, make a comfortable, regular sort of middle-class living. My daughter is extremely proud of me. My ex-wife is proud of me. Imagine that one, huh? Your ex-wife actually tells you, you're almost worth remarrying. But that won't happen. But still, the point being is that people that know me now see that, the guy finally achieved what he should have wanted to achieve 30 plus years ago. So one reason why I came on this show and came on the YouTube channel here is that I want to make the point that you don't have to do these things if you're younger and all that. For those of you who like to reach out, you can certainly look me up. I have social media. You can look me up, all that stuff, and I'll gladly, offer any advice that I can, if it's applicable kind of thing. And the other thing I wanted to do here too is point out that not every mobster looks like a mobster. Not every mobster was violent. I could actually say I was probably one of the least violent. In fact, the late Dennis Griffin, anti-mafia investigator, he passed away in 2021. He examined my case. He looked at my paperwork. He had said, look, you're in that 2%. And I'm, what's the 2%? He's all, the FBI gets 98% of its targets. And not just gets them, convicts them too. You're in the 2% that either they couldn't get because not enough evidence, or you evaded detection altogether. It's rare. It happens. He looked at my stuff I told him my tactics and what we did as precaution to get around electronic surveillance and all the other stuff. He said, yeah, I can see why you did it. And he's like, could you imagine if you would have taken all of those skills that you did then but had applied them just at a regular corporation or something, or a regular business or a regular workplace? You would be 10 times as wealthy. You would have made way more money. You wouldn't have to, you wouldn't have had to always look over your shoulder. But he did say, I'm amazed to see that there was a guy that was mob affiliated that was, for the most part, not the stereotypical tough guy. And that's how it really is, you guys. You'll see a lot of mobsters or ex-mobsters on social media, especially nowadays. Big rule violation, by the way. You're not supposed to be in the media if you're a mobster. But now they do it. Everybody's vain now, me included, I guess, on some level. But a lot of them, they're cliche mob movies guys, right? They're tough guys, this and that. Well, at the end of every mob movie, you know what happens? The FBI kicks in the door and arrests them all and puts them all in prison. Just remember that. So I appreciate, I want to say thank you to Mark from this channel, Soft White Underbelly, for having me. And I appreciate all of you listening to my story. And by all means, reach out on my social media. You're more than welcome to look me up, and I'll gladly help out and do whatever I can for you. All right.
All right.
Thank you.
Jeff, thank you very much. Great story.